The story dominating the news this week is Trump's trade war. Last week, the US president announced his intention to extend import tariffs to goods from the EU, saying, "We'll be doing something very substantial with the European Union," and warning that it would happen very soon. In response, EU leaders, who were gathered in Brussels for a meeting on defence, said the bloc would respond robustly and collectively to any tariffs imposed. French President Emmanuel Macron said that Trump's choices and statements were, quote, pushing the EU to be more united and more active to respond to issues of collective security, while Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said a trade war would be a complete mistake and that everything possible must be done to prevent it, quote, in the face of a Russian threat or Chinese expansion. However, there have also been some murmurings that one way of surviving a trade war with the US would be for the EU to warm its relations with China. In fact, according to a piece by the Financial Times columnist Gideon Rachman, when asked whether the EU might consider getting closer to China once again, one senior European policymaker said, "Believe me, that conversation is already taking place." So, in this video, we'll look at the EU's trade relationship with both the US and China, discuss how a trade war with the US might impact Europe, and whether the bloc could well end up pivoting to China. Who's the worst politician right now? Hear our thoughts and argue with us on our podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. First though, let's have a brief look at Europe's current trade relationships with the US and China. In the past few years, particularly during the Biden presidency, both the US and EU took an approach to China that was known as de-risking. This entailed restricting imports of certain technologies, like Chinese electric vehicles, to enable competition, while holding off on more sweeping tariffs on other exports like lithium-ion batteries that are required for all kinds of electronic items. Anyway, this approach was taken under the Biden administration's belief that, if the US wants to battle China for global dominance, it's stronger with the help of its European allies. EU-US trade is the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world, as well as the most integrated. In 2020, China overtook the US as Europe's biggest trade partner for goods specifically. But when services and investment are taken into account, the US remains the EU's largest trading partner by far. However, US President Donald Trump's position could not be more different from Biden's. Trump's protectionist America First policy revolves around making the US independent from all its allies, including through limiting trade. However, as commentators have pointed out, the possible or even likely outcome of a strained trade relationship with Europe is that the US's European allies will actually end up turning to China, the US's main rival, instead. Now, this brings us on to Trump 2.0. Last weekend, as we mentioned at the start of this video, Trump threatened Europe with import tariffs to redress the trade deficit. This refers to the fact that, last year, the US ran a trade deficit of €156 billion with the EU, according to EU data, meaning that the US imported €156 billion more goods from the EU than the EU imported from the US. However, as the graphs on screen now show, including services in overall trade significantly reduces the deficit with the EU. This is because there's a large transatlantic trade in financial services, intellectual property, and other professional services. And when looking at trade in services alone, the US actually runs a trade surplus with the EU. Regardless, last Sunday, Trump claimed without evidence that the US's trade deficit with the EU is over $300 billion, or €290 billion, which he called an atrocity, vowing to take measures against Europe next. The impact of tariffs, assuming Trump announces them, would be sizable. Like Trump's tariff announcements on Mexico and Canada, which we released a video about earlier this week on the TLDR Global channel, an announcement about tariffs on the EU would also have a significant impact on markets and the euro. Already, given the rising threat of US tariffs, the euro dropped 0.9% against the dollar early this week, to its lowest level in 2 years. Analysts also expect the euro-dollar pair to reach parity, i.e. trading at an equal value in 2025, the last time this happened being the start of Russia's full-scale war in Ukraine. Moreover, US tariffs on the EU would likely hit the bloc's biggest manufacturing and chemical firms the most, with cars, pharmaceuticals, and various types of machinery being the EU's biggest exports to the US. On top of that, Germany, Europe's biggest manufacturer, also has substantial operations in Mexico, which Trump has already targeted with tariffs, although those are now on hold for a month. This means Germany would likely be one of the hardest hit countries if Trump puts tariffs on Europe, a concerning prospect for Germany's stagnating economy. However, there's also more to consider than simply how much each country exports. In terms of total export value, Germany and Italy export the most out of any EU state to the US. But the share of exports to the US relative to total trade varies between countries. Ireland by far relies most heavily on the US for trade, with the US accounting for more than 25% of its total trade. Meanwhile, Germany and Italy's trade with the US is worth about 10% of their total, while Eastern European nations have lower shares. So now, some discussion appears to be happening behind the scenes about Europe pivoting to China. As well as the source quoted in the Financial Times that we mentioned earlier, there's also been reports that the EU Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, is softening her tone on China. Speaking to EU ambassadors on Tuesday, von der Leyen reportedly called the EU's relationship with China one of the most intricate and important anywhere in the world, adding that China was a vital trade partner. She also said that, whilst the bloc has seen, quote, growing imbalances and risks which come with doing business with China, the EU must, quote, engage constructively with China and find solutions in our mutual interest. Moreover, according to another source, an early version of von der Leyen's speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos last month was reportedly quite hawkish on China, before she decided to make a last-minute change, adding a sentence that referred to the 50th anniversary of EU relations with China in 2025 as, quote, an opportunity to engage and deepen our relationship with China, and where possible, even to expand our trade and investment ties. One way this apparent China pivot has been described is as working with the two legs of the triangle, whereby the EU isn't simply planning to ditch America for China, but rather to signal to Trump that the US could lose Europe. Europe is still very much aiming to work with Trump. In December, EU leaders discussed increasing defence spending to 3% of GDP, and the EU also expects to hold talks with US officials soon about buying more oil from the US. However, if Trump does ignite a trade war with Europe, that could well lead Brussels to view the US as an even bigger threat than China. He might have only been in office for a few weeks, but Trump has made a big impact already, as we've covered extensively. That's not all we have to say though, because there's a lot of weird and wild things we don't have time to cover in videos, from if Trump's becoming an imperial president, to America's wild history of territorial expansion, to questioning if the US is actually an oligarchy. All of these things could lead you to say, WTF USA, which is, appropriately, also the name of the series I'm literally telling you about right now. WTF USA takes a tongue-in-cheek look at the weirder side of US politics, unpacking what Trump's really up to and why Trump's kind of weird decisions could end up being incredibly impactful. WTF USA is released every other Friday only on Nebula, the streaming service we co-own with a bunch of your favourite creators. Those creators also make a ton of other exclusive Nebula content, including Tom Nichols' new documentary Boomers. In the feature-length documentary, Tom explores the wild truth that old people kind of run the world, unpacking why affordable housing, cheap education, living wages are slipping out of reach for younger generations, as well as questioning the questionable legacy of the baby boomers. It's not just original content either. You can also watch every normal TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in some instances before they land on YouTube. If you're not a member already, click our link in the description to get 40% off, which brings the price down to just $36 a year or $3 a month. That's a real steal considering all of the original content on the platform, and the fact that signing up using our link directly funds the channel and allows us to make more content going forward. So thanks for your support, and please do join us over on Nebula.